Let's talk about a lease agreement. We're going to talk about the different points inside of a lease. So we have the possession of the premises. That'll be defined in a lease. The use of the premises. The terms of the lease. We will address any security deposits, and we're going to be discussing Massachusetts rules and regulations regarding security deposits. We're going to be discussing improvements inside of the lease potentially, the maintenance of the premises, the non-allowance of waste on the premises. We'll talk about that. Destruction of the premises in the event of destruction, what's to happen. Assignments and subleasing or sandwich leasing, if it's allowed or not allowed, and the terms of how it's allowed. Recording a lease. Many times we'll go inside of a lease if we have to record it. For example, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we have to record leases of 7-year terms or greater in order for them to be acknowledged as part of our statute of frauds here. And then we have things like non-disturbance clauses and options to renew potentially. Not all leases have them standard, but some leases will negotiate options to renew or right of first refusal. The next section covers the different types of leases. And it's an important section to sort of get down. What's important in leasing is understanding the different types or the different definitions. And we have a few different types. The classic ones that you should know a little bit about are the gross lease, the net lease, the percentage lease, what a ground lease is, and what is a sale and leaseback. Now, if you're dealing with residential transactions, you won't see things like ground leases and sale and leasebacks. That's more in the commercial world. You will see gross leases and net leases in the residential world. Percentage leases, again, you'll see in commercial transactions. But let me run through these really quickly and define what they are. So first off, the gross lease. Very common in residential transactions. The gross lease, the landlord, the lessor, pays for all of the expenses associated with the keep and maintenance of that property, like the property taxes, like the insurance and so on, and or mortgage payments, for example, and the tenant pays a flat amount of money. So they pay a gross amount of money and the landlord collects that rent, and then they pay all of the expenses from that rent realized. That's a gross lease, very common in residential transactions. A net lease, you see in residential, you see it a lot in business as well. Sometimes you'll see it in residential transactions. In a net leasing transaction, the tenant pays a price per square foot to occupy the premises, and then they also have to pay a pro rata share of property taxes and expenses and utilities and so on. So the tenant pays for all of the expenses in addition to an amount of money which is net profit to the landlord after the tenant basically absorbs all of the expenses. And that's very common in the world of business and commercial leases. You'll also see it in residential as well in some parts and regions. A percentage lease can either be a gross lease or a net lease, and in addition to that, the landlord gets a percentage of the profits realized on the premises in which the business is doing transactions. So you'll typically see these maybe in malls, and those types of retail situations where a percentage of the profits is also taken by the landlord. And then ground leases and salebacks are commercial situations. In a ground lease, basically a developer is leasing unimproved land from a landowner, and once they develop and improve the land, they will lease it from the ground owner for a number of years. Many times it's going to be 99 years in these transactions so that the developer can realize their profitability on the development. So they'll hold on to it, they'll lease it long term, and then the ground owner basically collects a ground rent, and the tenant pays for everything else. So in essence, it's a net lease transaction, and the owner of the land is simply receiving ground rent. Very common in urban environments. And the sale and leaseback is a situation where a party purchases land from somebody else, requires it to be developed, and then sells it to a third counterparty and then leases it back for an adjusted period of time. And you see sale and leasebacks in a lot of corporations that want to sort of build, let's say, their office parks. They'll buy property. They don't want to own it. They don't want to have that risk on their books. So what they'll do instead is they'll hire a developer to develop it. They'll sell it to the developer, some subsidiary of a developer, and then lease it back long term. The corporation then gets a wonderful tax benefit of 100% deductible lease, and they don't have the risk and the day-to-day operation headaches of running the real estate. They also are getting their capital back and are now have recapitalized themselves so they can go off and utilize that capital as opposed to having it locked up into the real property. So a sale and leaseback you typically see in those situations. And again, that can be an entire 4-year college course, as a matter of fact. I mean, it's really, really deep subject. So I'm just trying to give you a quick overview of what these different types of leases are. In the next section, we're going to actually be getting into the Massachusetts landlord-tenant rules and regulations.